The champagne glass hit the marble floor first. Then General Marcus Holloway stood up, 3 stars on his shoulder. 61 years old. A man who had once told a room full of colonels to sit down and eat their dinner while a building 3 miles away was still on fire. That man rose from his chair so fast his napkin fell, and he stood at attention, and he saluted me. Nobody in that ballroom moved for 4 full seconds. Gerald Voss, the man who, 90 seconds earlier, had raised his own glass and called me David's little charity case in front of 40 investors, went the color of the tablecloth. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I picked up my napkin, folded it once, and set it beside my untouched plate of salmon. Because here's the thing, nobody in that room understood yet. I had heard every insult Gerald Voss had thrown at me for 6 months. The comments about my truck, the joke about my part-time library job, the night he leaned across his daughter's engagement dinner and said, loud enough for the whole table, "Some women just aren't built for this kind of family, David." No offense, Margaret. Everyone had laughed. I had laughed too. I'd learned a long time ago that the loudest man in the room is usually the one who's never been tested. Gerald had spent 6 months deciding exactly who I was. A widow, a woman behind a library desk, someone who drove a truck with rust eating through the wheel wells and wore her dead husband's flannel shirts because they still smelled like cedar and Marlboro Reds. Someone he could talk over, talk down to, and eventually talk out of 40 acres of lakefront land. His resort project needed more than it needed oxygen. He was half right. I was all of those things. He just never asked what I was before I became any of them. "General," Gerald said, laughing the way men laugh when they're buying time to think, "I think you've got the wrong table." Holloway didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on me. "The way you look at someone you thought was dead." "Ghost," he said. Just that. One word. I felt every muscle in Gerald's body go still 3 feet away from me. I didn't turn to watch him. I'd spent 22 years learning not to waste a reaction on an audience that hadn't earned one yet. "It's been a long time, sir," I said quietly. 12 years, Holloway said. His voice cracked, just slightly, in a way I'd only ever heard it crack once before in the back of a Blackhawk over Kandahar, watching his son bleed out on a stretcher while I flew through gunfire to get him to a table where surgeons were waiting. "You still owe me a drink for that landing." Somewhere behind me, Ashley, Gerald's daughter, my son's fiancée, whispered, "Dad, what is he talking about?" Gerald didn't answer her. He was staring at me like a man recalculating 6 months of arithmetic in real time, watching every number come out wrong. I looked at him then, just once, not with anger. I didn't need anger anymore. I'd used it all up a long time ago, somewhere over a mountain range, at 200 feet, under fire, and there hadn't been enough of it left to waste on dinner parties since. "You should sit down, Gerald," I said. "Your investors are staring." He sat down, but to explain why a retired, 3-star general saluted a woman in a thrift store cardigan in front of 40 terrified real estate investors, and why the man across the table from me had spent half a year quietly circling a piece of land he thought a charity case would never notice was worth stealing. I need to take you back 6 months, to the night my son first brought Ashley Voss home for dinner, and her father walked into my kitchen and decided, before he'd even taken off his coat, that he already knew everything about me. He was wrong about almost all of it. My name is Margaret Callahan. Everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 58 years old, and until 4 years ago, most people who met me would never have guessed I spent 22 years in the United States Army, or that for 11 of those years I flew a UH-60 Blackhawk out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, with the 101st Airborne, under a call sign I hadn't heard out loud in over a decade until the night General Holloway said it across a ballroom. Ghost. I earned it the way most call signs get earned, not because I chose it, but because of a joke that stopped being a joke. Early in my career, a flight lead told me I flew like something that wasn't supposed to be there. Low, quiet, gone before anyone registered the sound. It stuck. By the time I retired, half the pilots I trained didn't know my real first name. They just knew Ghost flew you out when nobody else would go back in. I flew over 200 combat hours in Afghanistan. Search and rescue mostly. Getting wounded soldiers off ridgelines and out of valleys where regular medevac wouldn't risk the approach. I lost 3 aircraft to enemy fire over the years. Not shot down, exactly, but hit badly enough that landing them counted as a small miracle each time. I never talked about any of it at dinner parties. I never talked about it at all, if I could help it. My husband, Tom, Used to say I kept my war in a box in the attic of my head, and I only opened it when nobody else was in the room. Tom died 4 years ago. Heart attack, in the garage, wrench still in his hand, halfway through fixing a lawnmower that didn't need fixing. I found him an hour later. Some days I think that hour is still happening somewhere, on a loop, and I'm still walking toward the garage not knowing yet. After the funeral, I sold the house Tom and I built outside Fort Campbell, took a part-time job at the public library in a small town called Millbrook Hollow, Kentucky, and moved into a 2-bedroom cabin on Otter Lake. 40 acres, most of it wooded, with a dock my father-in-law built with his own hands sometime in the 1970s. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't supposed to be. It was quiet. And quiet was the only thing I wanted for a long time. My son David is 29. He's an accountant in Nashville, an hour and a half from the lake, and he calls me every Sunday whether he has anything to say or not, which is its own kind of love language I never had to teach him. He inherited his father's habit of fixing things that don't strictly need fixing, and his father's quiet loyalty, and I like to think a little of my own stubbornness, the kind that shows up mostly in small ways, like refusing to let a bad grade or a bad breakup define an entire semester of his life. About 8 months ago, he called and told me he'd met someone. Her name was Ashley. She worked event planning for her father's real estate development company. She laughed at his jokes, which David will tell you himself is not an easy thing to accomplish. I was happy for him. I still am. In the complicated way you can be happy for your child and wary of the people orbiting him at the same time. Ashley, when I finally met her, was warmer than I expected a developer's daughter to be. She asked genuine questions. She remembered small details from previous conversations, the name of my dog, the fact that I still hadn't replaced the gutter that came loose in a storm the year before. I liked her immediately, and more than that, I could see, in the way she watched David when he wasn't looking, that whatever else was true about her family, her feelings for my son were not part of anyone's strategy. 6 months ago, David asked if he could bring Ashley up to the lake for dinner, and if her father could come too, since he wanted to get a feel for the family. I said of course. I made a pot roast. I put out the good plates, the ones Tom and I got as a wedding gift that I use maybe 4 times a year. I wanted David's future in-laws to feel welcome in my home. Gerald Voss walked through my front door wearing a sport coat that cost more than my truck, and the first thing he said, before he'd even shaken my hand, was, "So this is the famous cabin. David mentioned you had lake property. I didn't realize how much of it. Not hello. Not it's nice to meet you. An assessment. A number being calculated behind his eyes before he'd even taken off his shoes. I should have noticed it then. I didn't. I was too busy being a hostess. Too busy wanting my son's happiness to succeed. To clock the fact that Gerald Voss had walked into my home and immediately started measuring it. He was 54. Silver at the temples in that expensive, deliberate way. The kind of tan that comes from golf courses and not farm work. He owned Voss Highland Developments, a company that had built 2 golf resorts and a lakeside outlet mall an hour from Nashville, and as I would later learn was 6 months into quietly assembling land for a third project, a luxury resort and marina complex on Otter Lake, the largest undeveloped shoreline left within an hour of Nashville. My 40 acres sat directly in the middle of it. I didn't know any of that the night he sat at my table, ate my pot roast, and told a story about a business rival he'd outmaneuvered with the kind of pride most people reserve for saving someone's life. Ashley laughed at all the right places. David laughed too, a little nervously, the way you laugh at your girlfriend's father's jokes when you're trying very hard to be liked. Gerald asked me what I did for work. I told him I worked part-time at the library. Oh, he said, and there was a whole conversation packed into that single syllable. That's nice. Keeps you busy, I imagine. It does, I said. And before that, I was in the army, I said. 22 years. He nodded. The way you nod at something you've already decided isn't interesting. Admin work. Or aviation, I said. Huh, he said, and reached for the wine. And the conversation moved on to something about David's promotion at the accounting firm, and that was that. 22 years, summarized and dismissed in under 4 seconds. I remember thinking, in the moment, that I didn't mind. I'd spent my whole career being underestimated by men like Gerald Voss, and I'd learned there was a kind of peace in it. Let them assume. Assumptions were never my problem to fix. Later that same evening, over coffee, Gerald brought up Tom without quite meaning to, the way people do when they're circling a subject they don't realize is sensitive. David mentioned your husband passed a few years back. Must be hard, managing everything out here on your own. He gestured vaguely at the window, at the dark shape of the tree line beyond the porch light, as if the property itself were a burden I hadn't yet admitted to. I manage fine, I said. I'm sure you do, he said, in the specific tone people use when they mean the opposite. And then he smiled and asked David a question about the Titans game, and the conversation moved on, and I sat there finishing my coffee and understanding, without yet being able to name it, that I had just been quietly filed under a category widow, alone, coping that Gerald Voss would keep returning to for months, each time as though he were being generous, simply by noticing it. I didn't yet understand that Gerald wasn't just failing to be curious about me. He was building a file, and in that file, under the heading of Who is this woman, he had already written, widow, unemployed, except for a hobby job, no family money, sentimental about a piece of land she doesn't understand the value of. It would take him 6 months to discover how wrong every line of that file was, and by the time he found out, it would be in front of the exact audience he least wanted watching. The first time he tested the water was 3 weeks later, at a small family dinner at Ashley's parents' house in Nashville, a colonial with a driveway wider than my cabin's living room. I brought a bottle of wine, the nicest one I could find at the grocery store in Millbrook Hollow, which I now understand was roughly 1/10 the price of anything already in Gerald's cellar. He thanked me for it with the exact warmth you'd show a child who'd drawn you a picture. Over dessert, Gerald mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd been looking at some interesting parcels out toward Otter Lake for a potential development. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at David. Funny thing about your mother's property, he said, smiling. That's some of the last real waterfront left out that way. Whoever's sitting on that when the market catches up is going to be sitting pretty. Mom's not selling, David said, easily, the way you say something you've never had a reason to doubt. Of course not, Gerald said. I just mean it's valuable. More valuable than most people who own that kind of land realize. He turned to me then, finally, with a smile that didn't move his eyes. You ever think about what 40 acres like that is actually worth? Margaret? I think about what it's worth to me, I said. Tom's father built the dock with his hands. That's not on any market. Gerald laughed a short, easy laugh. The kind men like him use to signal that sentiment is a charming but ultimately irrelevant obstacle. Sure. I just mean, practically speaking. I understand what you mean, I said. He let it go. That time. I want to tell you what that fitting was actually like, because the version I've given you so far skims past something important. The boutique smelled like steam and rosewater. Ashley stood on a small pedestal in a dress that wasn't finished yet, pins still holding the hem, one shoulder seam basted rather than sewn, and she looked for a moment, before anyone said anything, genuinely happy. That's the part that made what came next land the way it did. Gerald didn't wait for a natural pause in the day. He created his own opening, the way men like him always do, by simply deciding the conversation belonged to him regardless of what else was happening in the room. The second time, he didn't let it go. It was 4 months ago, at what was supposed to be Ashley's wedding dress, fitting a small, private event at a bridal boutique in Nashville, family only, and somehow Gerald had arranged for it to be less about the dress and more about him. He'd brought a folder. An actual folder, with a leather cover, which he set on the little velvet bench in the fitting area, like it belonged there. While we're all together, he said, I wanted to raise something. Practical, not personal. He opened the folder. Inside were printed satellite images of Otter Lake, my property outlined in red. Gerald, Ashley said, glancing at David, is now really the time. It'll take 2 minutes, Gerald said, waving a hand. He turned the folder toward me. Margaret, I want to be straightforward with you, because I respect straightforward people. I'm putting together a resort project on the lake. $42 million development. Marina, lodge, residential lots. Your property is the single largest undeveloped parcel left on that shoreline, and frankly, it's the piece that makes or breaks the whole footprint. I see, I said. I'd like to make you an offer, he said. A generous one, more than fair market value. And I think, given that David and Ashley are about to be family, given that this land is going to be David's someday anyway, it makes sense to start thinking about it now, as an investment in their future, rather than... He paused, choosing his next words with the precision of a man who'd used them before, on someone else, and found they worked, rather than sitting on sentimental value that doesn't actually help anyone. The room went quiet. David's jaw tightened. Ashley looked at the floor. That land isn't sentimental value that doesn't help anyone, I said, keeping my voice level. It helps me. It's my home. Of course, Gerald said, in the tone people use right before they say the thing that erases everything they just agreed with. I just think, practically a woman your age, alone, 40 acres to maintain, property taxes going up every year. There's a version of this where everybody wins. You get a substantial payout, David and Ashley get a nest egg, and you get to actually enjoy your retirement instead of mowing 40 acres by yourself. I like mowing 40 acres by myself, I said. Gerald smiled the smile of a man who has decided you are being cute rather than serious and closed the folder. Think about it. No rush. I just wanted the number out there. He looked at David. Your mother's a tough negotiator. I respect that. I said nothing. I have flown aircraft through weather that would have killed a less patient pilot. And one of the first things you learn is that panic is a luxury you cannot afford mid-flight. I did not panic in that fitting room. I simply filed away, quietly, the fact that Gerald Voss had just tried to talk me out of my home in front of my son, using the language of family to disguise the math of a business deal. He was testing to see how hard I'd push back. I hadn't pushed hard enough yet for him to understand what he was dealing with. The third time was the night of David and Ashley's engagement party, 2 months ago, and this time Gerald didn't bother waiting until we were alone. The party was at a country club outside Nashville, the kind with a dress code and a wine list, longer than most menus. There were maybe 60 people there, mostly Ashley's family and Gerald's business associates, a scattering of David's friends, and me, standing near the edge of the room in the one good dress I own, feeling every bit like what Gerald had already decided I was. Gerald stood up to give a toast. He talked about David genuinely warm things, actually, the kind of praise that made me soften toward him for exactly 90 seconds about how proud he was that his daughter had found a young man with such a strong sense of responsibility, unlike some families where that kind of thing skips a generation. Then he turned, glass raised, and looked at me. And of course, we have to raise a glass to Margaret, he said, and the room turned to look at me too. 40 faces I mostly didn't know, smiling in the automatic way people smile at weddings and engagements. David's mother, who I have to say, has been an absolute trooper about everything, working her little job at the library, holding down that big piece of land all by herself. He chuckled, and a few people chuckled with him, not because it was funny, but because he'd laughed first. And laughter is contagious in rooms that want to feel good. Some women just aren't built for that kind of independence. But Margaret's made it work. David's little charity case, doing just fine. The room laughed. Not cruelly, most of them didn't understand what they were laughing at. He didn't know they were laughing at a woman being quietly humiliated in a room full of strangers, who'd decide who she was based on 90 seconds of a stranger's toast. I felt the heat climb up my neck before I could stop it. That old, useless reflex of the body registering shame a half-second before the mind can talk it down. Somewhere to my left, a woman I didn't know leaned toward her husband and murmured, "Bless her heart," in the particular southern register that means something closer to poor thing than any actual blessing. I kept my chin level and my glass steady, because I had learned a long time ago that the body gives you away before the face does, and I was not going to give Gerald Voss the satisfaction of watching my hand shake. David's face went white. Ashley's hand went to her mouth. Somewhere near the bar, I saw a man in his 60s, silver hair, ramrod posture, the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd spent decades being the first person into a room and the last person to raise his voice go very still, watching Gerald with an expression I couldn't quite read yet. I remember thinking, in that moment, that he looked like a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. I had no idea, standing there in my one good dress, that the arithmetic he was doing had anything to do with me. I didn't know it then, but that man was General Marcus Holloway, Ashley's godfather, an old friend of Gerald's from a country club membership, not from anything deeper. He had no idea who I was. Not yet. I raised my own glass, because the room was watching, and because 22 years of formation flying teaches you that the worst thing you can do under pressure is let anyone see the aircraft shake. "Thank you, Gerald," I said, evenly. "That's very kind." I did not correct him. I did not explain. Some people mistake silence for surrender. I found it's usually just patience, wearing a quieter uniform. Later that night, in the parking lot, David caught up with me before I got in my truck. He looked wrecked. The specific kind of wrecked that comes from watching someone you love get diminished in public and realizing too late that you should have said something. Mom, I'm so sorry. It's fine, David. It's not fine. He shouldn't have said that. No, I agreed. He shouldn't have. Are you okay? I looked at my son, 29 years old, raised by a father who died with a wrench in his hand fixing something that didn't need fixing, and by a mother who used to fly wounded soldiers off mountainsides at 200 feet under fire. And I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite grief. It was closer to a held breath, the particular stillness that comes right before you decide something. I'm fine, I said. Go back inside. This is your night. I drove home to the lake with the windows down, the September air cool against my face, and I did not cry, and I did not call anyone to vent, and I did not, as Gerald clearly expected, spend the next week quietly deciding to sell him the land, just to avoid another public humiliation. I went home. I fed the dog. I sat on Tom's dock in the dark for a long time, and I thought about the word charity case and what it would take for a room to understand, someday, precisely how wrong that word was. I didn't plan anything. I want to be honest about that, because there is a version of this story where I go home that night and start building a case, hiring a lawyer, digging up my old service records to have them ready as a weapon. That's not what happened. I didn't need to build anything. I had spent my whole adult life being exactly who I was, quietly, without needing anyone's permission to believe it. Gerald Voss's ignorance about my history wasn't a secret I was keeping from him. It was simply a fact he'd never bothered to ask about, because he'd already decided the answer didn't matter. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, standing in that parking lot, was that Gerald's interest in my land wasn't casual opportunism. It went back further than any of us understood. 3 weeks after the engagement party, Ashley came to see me alone. She drove out to the lake on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, and sat at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she didn't drink. I need to tell you something, she said, and I don't know how. Just tell me, I said. My dad's company has been in trouble for over a year. The outlet mall project it's underperforming, badly. He's leveraged almost everything into the Otter Lake Resort. If that deal doesn't close, I think he loses the company. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. He didn't want David to date me because he liked me for me, Maggie. I mean, he does like me, I think. But 6 months ago, before David and I were even serious, he had someone research the lake shoreline. He knew about your property before he knew about you. When he found out David was interested in someone whose mother owned the last parcel he needed. She stopped. She didn't need to finish. I understood, in that moment, sitting at my own kitchen table with my future daughter-in-law crying into a coffee she wouldn't touch, that Gerald Voss had not simply stumbled into disliking me. He had built a strategy, and my son's happiness was a mechanism inside it. The engagement wasn't fake. Ashley loved David. That much I never doubted, but Gerald had recognized, the moment he learned his daughter was falling for a young man whose mother sat on 40 acres of the one thing he needed most, an opportunity too convenient to leave alone. Every dinner, every toast, every practical conversation about my land wasn't improvisation. It was a campaign that had started before I ever met him. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because he's planning something for the investor Gala next month, Ashley said. He's going to make one more push, public, in front of everyone he's trying to get money from. He thinks if he embarrasses you enough, in front of enough people, you'll finally just sign something to make it stop. He's done it before, Maggie, with other people, before you. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Are you going to be at that gala? Yes, then so will I said. And Ashley, thank you for telling me. But I need you to know something. You don't have to fix this. You don't have to choose between your father and this family. This isn't your fight to carry. She started crying again, and I put my hand over hers, and I meant every word. But I also understood, quietly, sitting there, that something in me had shifted, not into anger, into clarity. The kind of clarity you feel in a cockpit when the instruments finally agree with what your gut already knew, that the storm ahead isn't something you can fly around, only through. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't hire an attorney or draft documents. That's not who I am, and it's not how this kind of thing gets resolved, not for someone like me. I had spent 22 years learning that the strongest position in any confrontation is the one where you don't need to say anything at all, because the truth is already standing in the room whether anyone acknowledges it or not. I did one thing, though, in the weeks before that gala. I called an old friend. His name was Colonel Danny Reyes, retired, a former flight surgeon who'd served 2 tours alongside my unit and who I hadn't spoken to in almost 4 years, not since Tom's funeral, where he'd flown in from Texas just to stand beside me at the graveside for 11 minutes and say nothing at all. Because some friendships don't need words to still be friendships. I called him not to ask for help. Exactly, but because I wanted to hear a voice that remembered who I used to be, before I stood in a room full of strangers who'd already decided who I was now. Ghost, he said, when he picked up, before I'd even said my name. Because some habits from 20 years of shared frequencies never fully leave a person. It's been too long. It has, I said, and for a moment neither of us said anything else, just the particular silence of 2 people who trust each other enough not to fill it. You sound different, Danny said, 20 minutes into the call. Something's coming. Maybe, I said. You need backup? I don't think I need backup, I said. I think I just need to walk into a room being exactly who I've always been, and let everyone else catch up. That's the ghost I remember, he said, and something in my chest loosened for the first time in weeks. The morning of the gala, I woke up early, the way I always do, before the sky fully commits to being light. I made coffee. I fed the dog, an aging shepherd mix named Radar, who Tom brought home as a puppy the year before he died, and who now moves slower than he used to but still waits by the door every morning like something important might happen. I walked down to the dock in my robe and stood there for a while, coffee cooling in my hands, watching mist come off the water the way it does most mornings in October, and I didn't think about Gerald Voss at all. I thought about Tom's father, who built that dock board by board over 2 summers in the 70s, measuring twice and cutting once, the way men of his generation did everything, and I thought about how strange it was that a stranger in a sport coat believed he understood the value of a thing he'd never once helped build. I fixed a loose board near the 3rd post, a small thing, 10 minutes with a drill, utterly unrelated to anything that would happen 12 hours later in a Nashville ballroom. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't preparation. It was simply what an ordinary Tuesday looked like for me, and I have come to believe that the ordinary mornings are exactly what people like Gerald never account for, because they assume a life spent quietly must be a life spent small. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear, the kind of October evening where the air smells like wood smoke even in the middle of a city. The event was held at a hotel ballroom in downtown Nashville. Voss Highland Development's annual investor showcase, the evening where Gerald courted the money that would make or break his 3rd resort. 40 investors, local business leaders, a scattering of retired military brass Gerald cultivated for the appearance of credibility, because nothing sells a lakeside development in Tennessee, quite like a few decorated veterans standing near the hors d'oeuvre table. I wore a simple navy dress, the same cardigan I always wore over it, because I have never once in my life dressed for an audience I didn't respect. David picked me up himself, quiet in the car, his jaw tight with the particular tension of a son who suspects his mother is walking into something and doesn't know how to protect her from it. Mom, he said, at a red light, if he says anything tonight, let him, I said. David, I need you to trust me on this. Whatever happens tonight, I promise you, it isn't going to be as bad as you think. It might actually be the opposite. He looked at me like he didn't fully believe it, but he nodded anyway, because that's the kind of trust 29 years of a mother's word buys you. Gerald spotted me the moment I walked in. I watched something flicker across his face, not fear, not yet, just a small flare of irritation, the look of a man who'd hoped I might quietly decline to attend an event I'd clearly been invited to purely as set dressing. He recovered fast. He always did. Margaret, he said, kissing the air near my cheek. So glad you could make it. Big night. I imagine it is, I said. Dinner unfolded the way these things do: long tables, careful placed cards, wine poured before anyone asked for it. I was seated 3 chairs down from Gerald, close enough to be visible, far enough to be irrelevant to the conversation, which I understood was exactly the geometry he wanted. I sat beside a man I didn't know, an investor from Memphis, who asked polite questions about my connection to the project that I answered honestly and briefly. I'm David's mother. I own property near the lake. That was all true, and it was all he needed. 2 tables away, unremarkable in a gray suit, sat General Marcus Holloway. I noticed him the way you notice weather changing, a pressure shift you can't quite name yet. I didn't know his name. I only knew the way you know these things after enough years around uniforms, even when they're not being worn, that he carried himself like someone who'd once commanded far larger rooms than this one. Gerald stood to give his remarks around the second course, working the room with the practiced warmth of a man selling $42 million of somebody else's future. He talked about vision, about legacy, about the families who would build memories on Otter Lake for generations to come. It was, I'll admit, a good speech. Gerald Voss had never lacked for charm. Charm had simply never been the same thing as character. And by the end of that night, 40 investors would understand the difference. Then, near the end of his remarks, he made his move. I want to say something about the land itself, Gerald said, raising his glass slightly, letting his gaze drift toward me with the practiced casualness of a man who had rehearsed this moment in a mirror. There's a story behind this project that I think speaks to what we're really building here. The last parcel we needed, the crown jewel of the whole shoreline, belongs to my future in-law. A wonderful woman. David's mother, Margaret. The room turned toward me. I kept my expression still. Margaret's had that land a long time, Gerald continued, smiling. More than she probably knows what to do with, if I'm honest. 40 acres, and from what I understand, most of her time these days is spent part-time at a small-town library. A small ripple of polite laughter. The kind rooms give a host out of obligation rather than genuine amusement. I've offered her a very generous deal, more than fair value. And I have to say, some women just aren't built for holding on to that kind of asset alone. No offense, Margaret. I only mean it kindly. It's a lot of land for someone in your position. There it was again. The same phrase from the engagement party, sharpened now, delivered in front of 40 strangers whose money depended on believing whatever story Gerald told them. David's little charity case, reframed as a woman in your position, but underneath it, the same intention. To make my ownership of that land look like an oversight, an inconvenience, a piece of sentimental confusion standing between Gerald Voss and the future he'd already sold to everyone in the room. I felt the old stillness settle over me, the exact stillness I used to feel strapping into a cockpit before a mission I knew would be difficult. Not fear, just readiness. I didn't stand up. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply looked across the table, directly at him, and said, clearly enough for the nearby tables to hear, Gerald, I'm not in a position. I'm on one. There's a difference, and I think you're about to learn it. The room didn't quite register the shift yet. A few people chuckled, assuming it was a light-hearted exchange between family. Gerald laughed too, though something behind his eyes had gone careful. Of course, he said. I only mean... And that was the moment General Holloway stood up. I want you to understand what that looked like, because I've replayed it since, more times than I can count. He didn't stand slowly. He didn't hesitate. His chair scraped back hard enough that the glass in front of him tipped and shattered against the marble, and the sound cracked through the room like something breaking that had needed to break for a long time. He stood at full attention, spine straight, chin level, the posture of a man who has saluted presidents and fallen soldiers and understood the difference between the two, and he looked directly at me, and he raised his hand to his brow in a salute so crisp it silenced every conversation in that ballroom. Ghost, he said. I felt every muscle in Gerald's body go rigid 3 feet away. I didn't turn to look at him yet. I kept my eyes on the general, because some moments deserve your full attention before you let yourself acknowledge anything else happening around them. It's been a long time, sir, I said. 12 years, Holloway said, his voice thick in a way I recognized instantly, because I'd heard it crack exactly once before. Years ago, in the back of a Black Hawk over Kandahar, watching his son bleed out on a stretcher while I flew low and fast through a valley that should have killed all 3 of us. You still owe me a drink for that landing, Chief Warrant Officer Callahan. The room had gone utterly silent. 40 investors, waiters frozen mid-step, Gerald standing there with his mouth slightly open, recalculating 6 months of certainty in real time. Dad, Ashley said quietly, from somewhere behind me. What is he talking about? Gerald didn't answer her. He was still staring at me, and I could see the exact moment the math finally landed, the moment he understood that the woman he'd spent 6 months describing as a charity case, as someone in your position, as a widow not built for holding on to property alone, was the same pilot. A 3-star general had just publicly saluted with tears standing in his eyes. I turned to him then, just once, calmly. You should sit down, Gerald, I said. Your investors are staring. He sat down. General Holloway didn't. He walked around the table, past 2 stunned waitstaff, and took my hand in both of his, an old soldier's handshake. The kind that says more than any sentence could. 22 years I've told that story, he said, loud enough now for half the ballroom to hear. The pilot who flew back into that valley under fire when 3 other crews called it too hot to attempt. Flew low enough, the enemy couldn't get a lock. Flew my son out with 2 units of blood left in him, and got him on a table 40 minutes before he would have died. I told that story at every dinner, every reunion, every time somebody asked me what real courage looks like. I never knew her name. She left before the debrief that night, pulled straight into another tasking. I spent 12 years wondering what happened to the pilot they called Ghost. He looked around the room, at 40 stunned faces, at Gerald frozen in his seat. And she's been living an hour from my house this whole time, apparently working at a library and getting talked down to at dinner parties. A murmur moved through the room, not laughter this time. Something closer to disbelief settling into shame. I saw the Memphis investor beside me set down his fork very slowly. I saw 2 other men near the back. The ones I now understood were the primary backers for Gerald's $42 million resort. Exchange a look I recognized immediately, because I'd seen that look before, on the faces of commanders realizing a subordinate had just cost them something they couldn't get back. General, Gerald said, finding his voice at last, forcing a laugh that convinced no one. This is I had no idea. Margaret never mentioned. No, I said quietly. You never asked. The room heard that. I watched it land on every face at every table, the way a held breath lands when it finally releases. Ashley stood up abruptly, her chair scraping the floor much the way Holloway's had, though for entirely different reasons. You knew, she said to her father, and her voice was shaking now, not with sadness but with something harder. You've been talking about buying David's mother's land for months. You told me it was a smart investment. You never once mentioned that she'd done this, that she was somebody. Did you even know before tonight? Gerald didn't answer. That silence answered for him. Actually, Ashley said, and her voice cracked in a different direction now, toward anger. I need to say something, and I don't care who's listening. Dad, 3 weeks ago I found the folder in your office. The one with satellite images of the lake? Dated 14 months ago. 14 months, Dad. That's before David and I were even serious. You were looking at that land before you knew who I was dating. You didn't like David for me. You liked what David's mother owned. Her hands were shaking, I noticed. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Whatever explanation he'd rehearsed for a smaller audience, in a quieter room, clearly wasn't built to survive, being said in front of 40 investors who had just watched a decorated general salute the woman he'd spent the evening diminishing. Sweetheart, he finally managed. It isn't as simple as... It's exactly as simple as that, Ashley said. You had the folder before you had me. I saw the date stamp myself. The room, which had already gone quiet for the general, went entirely, perfectly still for this. I hadn't planned this moment. I want to be clear about that. I hadn't asked Ashley to say a word tonight, hadn't coached her, hadn't even known for certain she would come. But there is a particular kind of justice that arrives not through anything you orchestrate, but through the simple accumulation of truth finally finding enough oxygen in a room to breathe. Gerald had built his campaign so carefully, so quietly, for so long, that he had forgotten the oldest rule of any operation. The moment enough people in the room start asking the questions you've spent months avoiding, the operation is already over. One of the investors near the back, a woman I later learned managed a private equity fund out of Atlanta, stood, gathered her purse, and said, evenly, to the table at large, I think I've heard enough for tonight. 2 others rose with her. Within 4 minutes, 6 of the room's largest backers had quietly excused themselves, the exact, silent, unhurried exit of people who have just decided, without needing to say so aloud, that they will not be putting their names or their money anywhere near Gerald Voss again. Gerald sat frozen through all of it, his face the color of the tablecloth, watching 4 decades of relationship building and 6 months of careful, quiet cruelty collapse in under 10 minutes, in the one room he had built specifically to impress the people now walking out of it. I want to be precise about what that collapse actually cost him, because vague justice never satisfies anyone, and I think the numbers matter more than the feeling. The Otter Lake Resort required $42 million in committed capital to break ground, and Gerald had, going into that gala, secured verbal commitments for roughly $31 million of it enough. His own project manager told David weeks later that he'd already signed contracts with an architecture firm and put down non-refundable deposits on permitting fees north of $400,000. Within 30 days of the gala, $18 million of those committed dollars had formally withdrawn. Within 90 days, the remaining backers followed, one by one, each citing some version of the same phrase, concerns about leadership integrity, until the project existed only on paper, in a filing cabinet in an office. Gerald could no longer afford to keep fully staffed. I didn't gloat. I want that understood clearly. I felt no triumph standing there, only a kind of settling, the particular calm that comes after a long flight, when the wheels finally touch ground, and you realize your hands have stopped shaking without you noticing when they started. I looked at Gerald one more time before I gathered my coat. For what it's worth, I said, I was never going to sell you that land, not because of tonight, not out of spite. Because Tom's father built that dock with his hands, and some things aren't line items on anyone's development plan. You could have asked me who I was, Gerald, any time over the last 6 months. You never did. You just decided, and you built an entire strategy on a guess you never bothered to check. He said nothing. There wasn't much left to say. I drove home that night with General Holloway's number saved in my phone and David quiet beside me in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the dark highway, processing an entire evening's worth of revelation about a mother he thought he already knew everything about. Mom, he finally said, somewhere past the county line, why didn't you ever tell me the full story? About Afghanistan? About all of it? I thought about that question for a long time before I answered it, because it deserved an honest answer, not a comfortable one. Because it was never a story I needed anyone to believe, I said. I know what I did up there. I don't need a room full of investors to know it too. I only needed you to know I'd be okay. Whatever Gerald tried tonight. And I was always going to be okay, David. That land was never really his to take. It just took the room a while to catch up to that fact. The weeks after the gala moved quickly, the way things do once truth stops being contained. 2 of Gerald's remaining investors formally withdrew within the month, citing concerns about leadership integrity and language, careful enough to avoid a lawsuit, but clear enough that everyone in Nashville's development circles understood exactly what had happened. The Otter Lake Resort project, which had needed $42 million and my 40 acres to exist, collapsed within 90 days. Voss Highland Developments laid off 11 employees before Thanksgiving. I heard, secondhand, that Gerald's outlet mall, Project, the one already underperforming before any of this began, went into foreclosure proceedings the following spring. I take no pleasure in any of that. I also did nothing to cause it beyond simply telling the truth when asked, and refusing to sell what was never for sale. Ashley didn't leave David. If anything, the whole ordeal seemed to clarify something in her, a distance from her father that had always existed quietly beneath the surface, and finally had a reason to surface fully. She moved out of his orbit, professionally and otherwise, took a job with an event company that had nothing to do with Voss Highland Developments, and started, slowly, building a version of her life that wasn't shaped around managing her father's ambitions. She still calls me sometimes, just to talk. I've come to genuinely love her, the way you love someone who chose honesty even when it cost her the easier relationship with a parent. Gerald and I have not spoken since that night. I understand from David that he sold his house in Nashville the following year and moved to Florida, where, as far as anyone can tell, he's attempting to rebuild something smaller and quieter than what he lost. I don't wish him ruin. I only ever wish to be seen accurately. And there is a particular kind of consequence that arrives not from revenge, but simply from a man discovering, too late, that the people he dismissed were never as small as his assumptions required them to be. General Holloway and I have had dinner 4 times since that night. His son, the young soldier I flew out of that valley 12 years ago, is 34 now. Married, with 2 kids and a bad knee that still aches before it rains. And he drove up from Georgia last spring, specifically to shake my hand, which undid me more than I expected it to, standing on my own dock in the quiet of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I still work at the library 3 days a week. I still drive the truck with rust eating through the wheel wells because it runs fine and there's no sense replacing something that still does its job. I still wear Tom's flannel shirts on cold mornings because they still smell faintly of cedar if I don't wash them too often. And some things you hold on to not because you need them, but because letting go of them would cost you more than keeping them ever could. Last month, David and Ashley got married on the dock behind my cabin. Small, quiet, maybe 40 people. Nothing like the ballroom where all of this started. There were no satellite images of the shoreline this time. No folders with leather covers. No talk of market value or crown jewels. Just string lights wound through the trees. A borrowed sound system playing songs Tom used to hum while he worked on that dock decades earlier. And a justice of the peace from Millbrook Hollow, who'd checked out library books from me for 11 years before he ever knew my last name had once belonged to a call sign. I stood at the edge of the water in a simple blue dress, watching my son marry a woman brave enough to tell the truth about her own father in a room full of strangers. And I thought about how strange it is that the loudest, cruelest rooms sometimes produce the quietest, most durable kinds of love, simply because everyone left standing in them finally had to decide who they actually wanted to be. Ashley's mother came, though Gerald did not. Nobody mentioned him. It didn't feel like an absence, so much as a simple fact of the evening, the way you might notice a chair at a table nobody expected to fill. General Holloway came too, in a linen shirt instead of a uniform, and stood near the dock with a beer in his hand for most of the night, looking entirely unlike the man who'd once saluted me across a ballroom floor. At one point, he found me near the dessert table and said, quietly, "You know, 12 years is a long time to carry a debt you don't know how to repay. I'm glad I finally got the chance." I told him he'd already repaid it the moment he stood up, and he laughed, and neither of us said anything else about it, because some things don't need repeating once they've been said honestly the first time. People sometimes ask if I regret staying quiet for those 6 months, if I wish I'd said something. The very first night Gerald Voss walked into my kitchen and started measuring my home like a spreadsheet. I don't. I've thought about it plenty, and I always land in the same place. I didn't need to prove anything to Gerald Voss. Not that night, not at the engagement party, not even at the gala. I only needed to keep being exactly who I already was, and trust that eventually, the room would catch up to the truth on its own. I think about that fitting room sometimes, the smell of steam and rosewater, Ashley on the pedestal in a dress that wasn't finished yet, still happy before her father's voice filled the room with numbers. I think about how easy it would have been to let his version of me win, to accept that 40 acres was too much land for a woman my age to hold on to alone, to sign the papers just to make the discomfort stop, the way I suspect other people have done before me, the way Gerald's whole business model seemed to depend on someone eventually doing. I understand now why Ashley cried at my kitchen table that Tuesday afternoon. She'd grown up watching her father win arguments, not through strength, but through other people's exhaustion. I simply never got tired in the way his strategy required. Some people spend their whole lives trying to convince a room full of strangers that they matter. I spent 22 years learning that the people who matter most rarely need convincing at all. They just need enough patience to let the quiet do its work, and enough self-respect not to shrink to fit someone else's small idea of who they are. I think about the general's face too. The way it looked in that half second before he stood, not shock. Exactly. More like recognition arriving all at once. The particular expression of a man realizing a debt he'd carried for 12 years had just walked into the room wearing a cardigan he'd never have suspected. I've flown into worse weather than that ballroom. I've landed harder aircraft on smaller strips with far less certainty about what waited for me on the ground. But I don't think I've ever felt as steady as I did standing there, watching 40 strangers finally see clearly, all at once, the woman Gerald Voss had spent 6 months trying to make invisible. If you've ever sat in a room where someone decided who you were before they ever asked, I hope you know this. Being underestimated is not a wound. It's an inheritance, quietly waiting to be spent on exactly the right moment. Mine came due on an October night in a Nashville ballroom, 12 years after a mountain in Afghanistan, delivered by a man in a gray suit who never stopped believing I was worth saluting. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll carry a little of it with you the next time someone decides who you are before they've bothered to ask. The end.